okay, Jay. This Wednesday night, we have what's called intermission. And intermission is an opportunity for us to gather in a more informal context over at the Resource Center right across the street. Let me tell you what we're going to talk about. We'll start with a little bit of time about thinking about God and what it means to worship and praise Him. We'll use music sometimes. Sometimes we use other means, creative means. And then we spend time in the Bible. We have some Bibles available. Encourage you to bring your own. And we'll look at the first chapter of Colossians. And in it, he talks about the kind of things that we need to know in order to bear fruit. And what we're talking about is we talk about things on Wednesday night in Colossians are root issues. And when Jesus talks about what it means to be His followers, He says that if we remain in Him, we'll bear fruit. And in this letter, He talks about root issues. What are those things that we need to know in order to bear fruit? And that's what we'll talk about this Wednesday night. I talked to a guy once. He says, I don't need to know anything more about the Bible. I just need to do what I already know. And it sounded good, but it's wrong. What he ends up saying, Paul does in the first chapter, he goes, in order to believe, in order to behave, this is what you need to believe. And he says, this is what you need to know in order to bear fruit. So this Wednesday night, we'll talk about what do we need to know. And why does knowing this thing lead to doing the kind of things God wants us to do? Bearing fruit, giving thanks, being able to persevere. So that'll be this Wednesday night, 7 o'clock over at the Resource Center. This morning we're talking about plain talk. I'll let you know why it's called that in a second. Every person on earth lives his or her life according to one of three rules of conduct, all of which are metallic. Iron, silver, or gold. Each one of us lives our life primarily according to one of those three rules. We're going to look at each of them one at a time. And we'll try to, and as we talk about them, let's ask the question to ourselves, what rule do I live by? What rule do you live by? The iron rule, the silver rule, the golden rule. Let's take them one at a time. The iron rule. The iron rule, easy to understand, is the rule of power and force. And what the iron rule says is might makes right. It's the rule of the bully who beats up other kids because he can, because he's bigger, because he's stronger. Sometimes it's what happens with dictators, Saddam Hussein, who dominates people. And I know that there was a time when there were other individuals who were in the government, and he was at this conference, invited a bunch of people to come, and he had the different rivals eliminated. Why could he do that? Because somehow he had gotten control of the army, the military, and he was able to do that. He ruled by force. The iron rule. Military rulers have found the iron rule quite convenient. Some ones that come to mind, Alexander the Great, who talked about as being one of the greatest military leaders of all time, conquered a tremendous amount of territory in a very short period of time, 12 years or so. One time he conquered Gaza, took the governor, bored holes in his heel, attached him to a horse and a chariot, and dragged him through the street until he died, which I guess part of the reason why he conquered so quickly. Ruthless. Julius Caesar, another one, ends up saying something that's in the worship folder, just a little quote that those who live by it, the iron rule will understand. Veni, vidi, vici. When he conquered a king, I came, I saw, I conquered. Why? Because I could. Lived by the iron rule. He had the strength. He exerted that strength. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Charles Darwin, interestingly enough, gave scientific respectability to the iron rule. He's the one that ended up talking about the survival of the fittest. And in his opinion, all species survive, thrive, and develop by destroying their weaker competitors. And then I found a quote where he kind of applies this politically. And this is what he had to say. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who, from a weak constitution, would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. He ends with this chilling statement. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Understand what he's saying. To help the imbecile, the sick, the impoverished, the weak, is to do damage to us as a race of people. And if you're thinking, who applied this thinking politically? Adolf Hitler. In creating a master race, eliminated the mentally handicapped, felt like the Jewish race was a subservient, inferior race, and so eliminated them, slaughtering millions in order to carry out this kind of iron rule. Iron rule, there is a story in the Bible that we're going to check in on. We're going to meet three different people, three different groups, all in this one story, each one of which represents one of the three rules. They either represent iron, silver, or gold. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. Look what it says in your worship folder. Let's pick up just the first verse from that. We read, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Hebrew man was traveling 20-mile long road that led through a barren region of crags and ravines from Jerusalem to Jericho. It was downhill, and there were not a lot of places. It was open, kind of a mountainside, barren mountainside, no trees, just rocks, a wilderness kind of place, but you could hide behind rocks. So robbers oftentimes would hide behind the rocks. Individuals would come by when there was somebody alone. They would take advantage and beat him. Why were they doing that? Why would they do that? They were living by the iron rule. They had superior numbers. They had weapons. They had surprise on their side, and they would victimize people, feeling that that was the way they wanted to live. So that's what happened. And the person who lives by the iron rule then are the robbers. They take this man, beat him, tear off his clothes, leave him half dead by the roadside. What did they live by? We are many, you are one. We are strong, you are weak. You have possessions, we want them, we will take them. Why? We live by the iron rule. The clenched fist of iron. Anyone who seeks to dominate another person in order to get what they want, using superior power or force, it's what's behind rape. It's what's behind the abuse of children or the abuse of women or the abuse of others. Superior force in order to enforce my will, the iron rule. Then there's the silver rule. This is the contribution of most religious systems. Most religious systems will talk about this kind of rule which gives some limits to what you should do. Don't live by the iron rule. You'll end up creating a society where people will be victimized and victimize others, where I'll hit you, you'll hit me, we'll hit them, and our society will become one of chaos and violence. Rabbi Hillel, Judaism, was a proponent of the silver rule. He said this, what is hateful to yourself, do to no other. And that's an example of the silver rule. It's what you don't want to happen to yourself, don't do to somebody else. So, what that would mean, would you like to be beaten by the roadside? Therefore, don't beat somebody else by the roadside. Don't lie in wait for them. Don't rob somebody. Don't murder somebody. Don't hurt somebody. Why? Because you wouldn't want to be murdered. You wouldn't want to be hurt. You wouldn't want to be the subject of violence. If you don't want it to happen to you, don't do it to others. And Judaism was a proponent of the silver rule. Buddhism, Hinduism, proponents of the silver rule. Taoism, and Confucius had this to say. One of his students said, "Is there one word that will keep us on the path to the end of our days?" And Confucius is reported to have said, yes, reciprocity. What you do not wish yourself, do not do unto others. And everybody that talks about the silver rule, they all have this in common. They forbid certain kinds of activities. You wouldn't want somebody to steal your wallet. You wouldn't want somebody to steal your purse. Therefore, don't steal somebody else's wallet. Don't steal somebody else's purse. Why? You wouldn't want it. Don't do it to somebody else. And the silver rule forbids behaviors. However, the place where it's not the golden rule, and we'll see the difference, is that it doesn't encourage behaviors, it just prohibits them. So, don't steal a purse, but if you find one lying around, the silver rule doesn't prohibit you from taking it. You know, if you can't return it, it stops a little bit short. The silver rule we see in this occurrence in 1964 that provoked a lot of discussion relative to what is our responsibility towards one another. Very famous incident had to do with Catherine Genovese returning one night in New York City to a really decent part of the city, the Kew Gardens. And she was returning one night. She was attacked in a courtyard in the place where she lived, the Kew Gardens, attacked in a courtyard by a man wielding a knife. And he stabbed her repeatedly. She cried out, screamed out. He became afraid, and he ran from the scene. And she continued to cry out, and no one came to her aid. The man returned, repeatedly stabbed her until she died. And in a subsequent police investigation, they learned that 38 residents admitted to seeing some of the attack. And none of them responded. They didn't dial 9. This created a storm of controversy. But when you look at it, they didn't go down and beat this woman. They didn't do anything to her. They didn't steal her money. They didn't spit on her. They didn't do anything wrong. And nobody broke the silver rule. The silver rule. If you look in your worship folder, what it says, and again, to continue on with the story, this guy's lying along the side of the road, beaten, naked, half dead. A priest happening to go down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. A priest was a religious professional. He was a clergyman. A Levite was a layperson who served the priest. So you have both a clergyman and a layman, both a very religious people, very church people. In fact, that's where they were coming from, most likely. They were coming from Jerusalem, having served, having done what they were supposed to do, and they were going from Jerusalem to the outskirts, maybe to where they lived. Jericho was kind of a bedroom community of Jerusalem. They perhaps had served their time, and now were going home. At any rate, both of them crossed to the other side of the road and perhaps even hastened their steps. Now, this was a fellow Jew, but what was it that directed their thinking? It might have been something like, the tragedy's not my fault, it's none of my affair, and they went by on the other side. Did they violate the silver rule? Well, they didn't kick the afflicted Jew. They didn't rifle his pockets. they simply passed on. They were silver rule men. They would never have robbed this individual because they would live by the silver rule. If you don't want to be robbed, don't rob somebody. So the priest and the Levite, they lived by the silver rule. The robbers lived by the iron rule. The priest and the Levite lived by the silver rule. Now let's talk about the golden rule. The golden rule is the one that Jesus proclaims. You see the verse, do to others as you would have them do to you. From some things I looked and did some investigation, those who have studied historical documents say there's little evidence of the existence of any pre-Christian parallel to this positive rule. In other words, no one had ever really said this before as a rule of ethic and a rule of conduct. People had said the silver rule. Again, Confucius said it 500 years before. Different ones said it. But anybody clearly saying this was the first time anybody ever said anything like that. Not, do not do what you wouldn't want others to do, but do what you would want them to do to you. That's the golden rule. Something really never been said before. It's a new version of life and its obligations. And Jesus is the one who says it out loud and really says it first, says it most clearly, and He's the one that, in fact, in the story, He says what this looks like. The golden rule, let's pick it up. The story is Samaritan, under point 3, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins, gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said. When I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Jesus goes on to say, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. You know that the Samaritans are dedicated enemies of the Jew. And in the days of civil rights, one of them would have been white and one of them would have been black. One of them was a Sunni, one of them was a Shiite. One of them Muslim, one of them Christian. They were devout, dedicated enemies of one another, and their antipathy, their animosity just stemmed to 1,000 years before. Long-term controversy, Hatfields and McCoys, Jews and Palestinians, that kind of thing. He saw a fellow human need, a Hebrew, and was moved with compassion. He tended the injured man's wounds, set him on his own donkey, brought him to a nearby inn where he paid 2 silver coins, pays for more than 3 weeks of lodging. So he takes out his checkbook, writes a check for 3 weeks of lodging, pledges on the return to cover even more if the individual needs it. His thinking, and this is golden rule thinking, but for the grace of God, I could be writhing in agony by the roadside. What would I want if our situation were reversed? And that's golden rule thinking. What would I want if the situation were reversed? If I was in need? If I was impoverished? If I was needy? What would I want if someone came by? Would I want them to pass by? No, I wouldn't want them to pass by. I would want them to stop. I would want them to care. And that's what the golden rule, that's the kind of thinking is represented in the golden rule. And this individual then, the Samaritan, he is the one that followed the golden rule, the Jesus rule. And this is what Jesus is after. He identifies as the calling card of His followers. Again, look at that second paragraph under point 3. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. There was a famous message somebody gave once upon a time, I think about 100 years ago. An individual who said that he was going to give the text that he was going to speak from at the end of the message, and he went to tell the story of the Good Samaritan. And he talked about this guy goes by, and then he talks about the guy who loved and did the thing that Jesus wanted to be done. Then the very final thing he says, and now I close with the biblical text. And he said this, go and do likewise. Clearly, it's Jesus' ethic for things, not just do what you can do. Might does not make right. Not don't do what you wouldn't want done. That's part of it, but that doesn't go far enough. Do what you would want others to do for you. That's the golden rule. What does it mean to live by the golden rule? To live by it means a couple things, I think. Number one, to serve the needs of others. To serve the needs of others. Again, Jesus didn't say, go and feel a certain way. You know, when we read the word mercy, mercy for us can be a feeling. It's when I see somebody in pain and it touches my heart, and so I might see somebody by the roadside, and you know how gaper's block always occurs. You wonder, what in the world is holding the traffic up? And then you see that there's an accident. Always when there's an accident, you know, people slow down, and it can really be a slowdown. I've done a lot of long distance trips, and out of nowhere, the traffic is stopped. You wonder, what in the world? I hope nobody broke down. You're trying to get from here to there in a decent amount of time, and then finally traffic comes up, and so many times I've seen there's just not an accident in the road, but something off the road, and and they kind of feel, oh boy, I'm glad that wasn't me. Mercy is not just feeling something. Again, what Jesus says, not go and feel anything. See, that's the thing we have about love. Love is not primarily something you feel. Biblically, love is a verb, not a noun. Not something you feel, something you do. It's about serving somebody else's interests, not just your own. It means pulling over. It means rolling up your sleeve. That's what it means as Jesus indicates the rule he would have us live by. And the more you look at this rule, it's disturbing. It puts all of us in a position where we look at our lives and we say, well, I'm not an iron rule liver and I live by the silver rule, but this is a higher rule. It means serving the needs of others, and that's what the Good Samaritan did. In Jesus' time, and in fact, why this is called plain talk, it's Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. We don't know if it was a different occasion. What we do know is that Jesus' emphasis in this version of what we studied once in the Beatitudes is different. It has a different focus. And it might have been the same, might have been a different occurrence, but it says Jesus taught them from a level place, a plain. And what he gave them, plain talk. Plain in that it was level ground, but plain in that it made clear things that were very confusing. And at that time, people had taken God's requirement and had made it so that there are loopholes. Loopholes, loopholes, loopholes. And so there was no real clear sense of, tell me what I'm supposed to do. And that was modeled by the religious leaders, for instance. It says, love your mother and your father. Honor your father and your mother. The religious professionals, they had taken this thing and they had added a little caveat, a little loophole. There was this thing called Korban. And if I wanted to dedicate something to God, say if I had an amount of money or possessions, I could identify these possessions as Korban, dedicated to God. And this is what this would do. Say if my parents come to have needs, and they come to me as their son, say, son, we really need some things. Your father's not doing well. You know, he can't do what he used to do, and I'm not doing well. And I could say, oh gosh, you know what, I feel so bad. I feel terrible that Dad's going through that. But, boy, you know what? This is Korban. God. Dedicated to God. I can't give it to you. I'm really sorry. Is there anything else? No, nothing else I can do? I'm sorry. And that was a way to get around honoring your mother and your father. And Jesus blew him up for that. Says, come on. Don't create loopholes like that. That's not what the commandments said. Honor your father and your mother. Do it. Don't keep it aside for a rainy day. If they're in a position where you can alleviate their distress, alleviate the distress. Do it. And again, what he's talking about is don't feel something. He's not giving them, feel bad for them. He's not saying that. He's saying do something. If they get in a place where they're hurting, there's a tangible need that you can take care of, do it. Serve the interests of others. That's what he's saying. Again, not a feeling, but an action. It's a story about a bitter cold evening in northern Virginia years ago. Old man sat by the river waiting for a ride across. His body had become numb. Stiff. It was a wide river. He couldn't go forth on foot. If he had a mount, a horse, he'd be able to do it, but he couldn't. He heard the rhythm of approaching hoofbeats, and then different riders approached, and he looked up at them. He saw the first and let him go by, galloped by. Didn't make any effort to get his attention, saw another one and another one. He kind of looked up and then looked away. Finally, the last rider neared the spot where the old man sat. This one drew near. The old man caught the rider's eye and said, "Sir, would you mind giving an old man a ride to the other side? There doesn't appear to be any passageway by foot." Reining his horse, the rider replied, "Sure thing, hop aboard." Seeing the old man was unable, his body was frozen. He couldn't even get himself up on the mount, up on the horse. So the rider got down off the horse, helped the man up, jumped on the horse, gave him a ride, not only across the river, but to the place where he was going, which several miles past. As they neared the cottage, the horseman's curiosity caused him to inquire, "You know, sir, I noticed that you let several other riders pass by without making an effort to secure a ride. I came up and you immediately asked me for a ride. I'm curious. Why, on such a bitter winter night, would you wait and ask the last rider? What if I had refused and left you there?" The old man lowered himself slowly down from the horse, looked the rider in the eyes, and replied, "I've been around these parts for some time. I know people pretty well." He continued, "I looked into the eyes of the other riders and immediately saw that there was no concern for my situation. It would have been useless even to ask them for a ride. But when I looked into your eyes, kindness and compassion were evident. I knew then and there that your gentle spirit would welcome the opportunity to give me assistance in my time of need." The rider, heart-warmed by the comments, touched the horseman. These comments touched the person who had given him a ride very deeply. "I'm most grateful for what you have said," he told the old man. "May I never get too busy in my own affairs that I fail to respond to the needs of others with kindness and compassion." With that, President, at that time I believe, Thomas Jefferson turned his horse away and made his way back to the White House. Again, that's kind of what Jesus is indicating, the thing that he would have us do. And frankly, the thing that gets in the way of that is busyness. I've told you before about what happened at Princeton University, where they had somebody talk about and study the parable of the Good Samaritan. Told this group of theology students that they were going to go and present a talk on the Good Samaritan and that they had to get across campus to do so. Told another half of the class, "You're going to go talk about why people should study theology." Again, halfway there was a guy who was in trouble. And they gave each of these two teams, one going to talk about the Good Samaritan, one going to talk about why study theology. Of this, they gave some of these people enough time to get across campus, some of them just enough time. And what they found, those who stopped had nothing to do with what they were going to say. Those who were going to talk about the Good Samaritan did not have a higher percentage of people who stopped than the ones who were going to talk about theology. The thing that determined whether some stopped and whether some did not is how much time they had. Those who had to get across campus quickly did not stop. Those who had a little more time to get across campus did stop. What gets in the way of living the Golden Rule? I'm not sure that it's an absence of care. I think we see people in distress and it touches us. Perhaps it's because we're going by so quickly. And I guess that's, as we think about it, why is that? Why is that? I think when Jesus talks about that, those kind of influences that keep us from bearing fruit, what he says, we've talked about this a lot recently, the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of riches, and the pleasures of this world choke the seed so that it remains unfruitful. Why don't we stop? Why don't we stop? It's because we're going someplace quickly. That's what it talks about, the influence of worries, riches, and pleasures. It's not that they make us not care, they just make us too busy to stop. Being too busy to stop still is a violation of the Golden Rule. If we were by the roadside, we would want somebody to take the time to stop. I think it's interesting, again, when it talks about the influence, they crowd out what might be an opportunity to stop. I don't know what we're going to do with this. You know, the more time-saving devices we get, the busier we are. Now, time is the commodity that people will not sacrifice. Money is sacrificable. Throwing money at things is now preferred over giving time. And it's that type of thing that I think gets in the way of living the Golden Rule. But it means, to live by the Golden Rule means serving the needs of others, but serving the needs of them, not just us. And if love is deep in that it's giving, it means to be broad, because it's not enough just to love the people who are comfortable to love. Clearly, that's in the passage. Love means meeting the needs of them as opposed to us. All of us naturally create a sense of us and them. Who are the us? You could answer that a number of different ways. Us is our family. Us is our church. Us is our business. Us is our culture. Us is our color. Us is our race. Them, that church, that color, that race, that group, us and them. And it's easier to love us. We see a smile in response to it, a pat on the back. There's a sense of reciprocation. Hey, you know, boy, thanks. If there's ever anything I can do for you, forget it, you know. And then if there's a chance to reciprocate, not that that's wrong, it's just that it's not what the Golden Rule is asking of us. It's asking of us to serve the needs of those who are not in a place to reciprocate. And even if they did reciprocate, we might not want it. It's like what the Samaritan did for the Jew. I'm not sure he liked that guy. But that's not what love is about. Love is not about liking. It's about a person has a need. We are in a position to meet a tangible need, food, shelter, some kind of concern, and we do that act. Whether the person is comfortable for us or not. What it says in the third paragraph under point 3, Jesus, again, clearly his point, do to others as you would have them do to you. Then he goes on, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. His point seems clear. It's not just enough to love the lovely or the friendly. It's not enough to love those who are nice to you. Some churches are very loving. You know, I'm like, but it's easy to love those who are within the walls. You know, some churches might pride themselves, we're a very loving, warm church, and thinking that therefore God looks down at us. Oh, I like that. And that, yeah, God does want people to be loving. But if the love just stays within the walls of those, because this is us. This is us. People gathering in a small group. Again, love people in a small group. We're all about small groups. We'll be talking about 2020 groups and groups that you could sit with other people, and this is vital, critical, important. However, it's not that God looks down and says, that's what I'm looking for. He's looking for something broader than that. Something where love is extended, not to one of us, but to one of them. To somebody on the other side. To somebody we're not going to get something back from. What Jesus is doing, He's laying down a rule of conduct. And because He does something that is kind of uncomfortable. It makes it so that sins of omission matter, not just sins of commission. You know the difference between omission and commission? A sin of commission is when you do something you shouldn't do. That's a sin of commission. You steal from somebody. You rob somebody. You do something bad to somebody. That's a sin of commission. A sin of omission is not when you do something that you shouldn't have done, but you don't do something that you should have done. There was a guy by the side of the road, and you didn't pull over. There was this country. They don't have enough food to eat, and you didn't give anything. That's what a sin of omission is. And the uncomfortable thing